Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Rory Butcher. Rory is a recent doctoral candidate at the University of Leeds. His research focuses on military and civilian experiences during the period of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, addressing themes of national identity, martial masculinity, and negotiated authority. Today, Rory will share the forgotten history of the Fencible Regiments, assessing their role during the period of deep national crisis that accompanied the wars of the French Revolution. There will be a chance for questions at the end in both in-person and online audiences. For our online audience, you can post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I'm now going to hand over to Rory and hope you all enjoyed today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Good afternoon, all, both in person and online. Thank you for joining me at the NAM for my first guest talk. I'm not sure if it's like the Royal Albert Hall in that you play it once on the way down, but I guess we'll see. So for those who don't know me, as Amy said, I've just recently completed my PhD looking at the Fencible Regiments, or fencibles, during the French Revolutionary Wars, i.e. from the execution of Louis XVI of France through to the Peace of Amiens in 1802. And so this talk is drawn from several strands of work that I've done over the last 4 years, consolidated into something a bit more interesting for you lovely people here today. Because I really do passionately believe that the fencibles are fascinating, both in and of themselves, but also what they tell us about the British Army and its relationship with British society in this period. And that's what I'm here to share with you in the next 45 to 50 minutes or so, by addressing several sort of key questions. Firstly, what were the fencibles? Lots of blank faces, I'm sure we can address that. Secondly, why? Why were they raised in Scotland and why were they popular outside of Scotland? How were they treated at the time by government and by the public? And then why? Why has this shaped how they have been discussed since, and why might they have been forgotten? Now, I acknowledge that it's already beginning to sound a bit like I've swallowed the historian's guide to buzzwords, and whilst that may be true, the answers to these questions do help us explore the fencibles and their place in history. So we'll start with the big question, what were the fencibles? And for this, we need a bit of period context. Thankfully, this is one of the few audiences where I shouldn't have to go into too much detail. You're here at a military museum by choice, after all. But for those who need a refresher, England has been staunchly anti-Catholic since the 1530s, when everyone's least favourite Tinder match, Henry VIII, created the Church of England to allow him to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. This break with Rome continued to cause significant escalating tension into the 17th century as several Stuart monarchs, featured here, insisted on flirting with Catholicism and most problematically actual Catholics. This came to a head during the reign of James II, who had 2 Catholic wives, converted to Catholicism, and then had a Catholic son, who displaced his 2 elder Protestant daughters in the succession. Facing the prospect of another Catholic king, Parliament invited his eldest daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William to take over in 1688 in what was called the Glorious Revolution. In time, Mary's sister Anne became queen, and the throne of the then united Kingdom of England and Scotland passed to her Hanoverian cousins in 1714, starting with George I. Meanwhile, the Jacobite cause, named after the Latin Jacobus, for James, persisted as James II, his son, the would have been James III, and his son, Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, continued to make attempts to reclaim the throne, notably in the 1690s, in 1715, and in 1745, which ended at the Battle of Culloden, all obviously unsuccessful. Now, these rebellions rather complicated Scotland's 1707 union with England, in that it's quite hard to argue that your population are loyal subjects if some of them keep rebelling. Now, it's important to say that the Jacobites were a minority of Scots, and loyalties to the Stuarts crossed religious, geographic, and socio-economic divisions, but many came from historically clan areas, outside the influence of the Protestant Church of Scotland, or Kirk. So whilst it's incorrect to say that all Jacobites were tartan-clad Outlander-style Highlanders, at least some were. And that posed a problem for the British government in 1757, when, with the 7 Years' War beginning and troops needed overseas, Pitt the Elder's government needed solutions for home defence in the event of an invasion. In England and Wales, they raised the English and Welsh militia, a force primarily run by county administrators. For those familiar, this is what the Lord Lieutenant's job originally was. Militia officers were gentry or nobility because they were only able to achieve a rank that they had met the property qualification for, and with each subsequent rank requiring a greater degree of wealth. The rank and file were balloted, literally lottery, unlucky, lucky dip, depends how you see it, I guess. But arguably, entirely reasonably, Pitt really didn't want to forcibly arm a potentially disloyal Scottish population. The English population would continue to protest and riot enough when the English militia was being raised, and the Scots weren't universally on board with the idea of being made to fight English wars. Volunteers into the army, one thing, but not balloted militia. Instead, they turned to a Scottish concept of a fencible force, literally deriving from the word defensible. The first proper use of the word was to describe temporary Scottish armies raised to fight in the 17th century, but this term potentially dates back as far as the medieval period. And it was really used to refer to those who were compelled into military service through a sense of duty to the crown, an obligation for all male citizens who were capable of taking up arms for the protection of their country during a time of crisis, which really was the same concept as the militia in England. So when Pitt the Elder needed a solution for Scottish home defence, the obvious choice was a fencible force. With the Highlands, a previously established area with good recruitment numbers, he turned to Scottish Highland clans that he knew to be loyal, Sutherland and Argyll, who had both served against the Jacobites, and asked them to raise regiments of men from their own clans for such service. They were to serve only in mainland Britain and only until the end of the war, like the militia did. They did a good job, and when, in 1778, there was another need for home defence, thanks to America, more regiments were raised in Scotland and very briefly in Ireland, again from men known to be loyal, and again only for temporary service in Britain. Which brings us now to 1793. War is looming with revolutionary France, and with many Scottish lords, lairds and gentlemen, particularly from the Highlands, keen to do their part, the offers to raise fencibles soon came flooding in. There was almost an assumption that the fencibles would be raised again. They were now an integral part of Scotland's contribution to the war effort. And it's here where we meet our first historiographical stumbling block. Because when we think of Scotland in the 18th century, I suspect most in the room do think about that tartan-clad Highlander ideal that I mentioned earlier. Is that fair to say? A few nods around the room, maybe. And it's true, the relationships between clan chieftain and his men, the bonds of kith and kin, defined the lived experience of those in the Highlands in this period. The persistent ideal of noblemen making emotive appeals to their clansmen to take up arms owed much to the soldiers recruited to the British Army from within and without the Highlands in the years before and after the Battle of Culloden. Scottish soldiers wearing the red coats of the British Army served across the globe during the 1760s, 70s and 80s, and it was their very successful service in America which cemented the popular imagery of the true Highland spirit. In the years after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, steps had been taken to make being a Highlander illegal. Kilts, swords and the Gaelic language were banned, pipes weren't used for any formal occasions, and emblems like thistles were seen as traitorous. But the development of the Highland regiments assuming this iconography, especially kilts and bagpipes, no matter how few of the men actually were Scottish, acted as a way to show that Scots were now loyal to the British Empire. And it's, in fact, arguably, it is this tartan-clad military service and success which made the English public more receptive to Scottish soldiers, making these savage rebels more acceptable as part of Britain. The 19th century saw a renewed interest in the Highlands, particularly as a result of Scottish military contributions during the Napoleonic Wars and at the Battle of Waterloo, partially as a result of George IV's visit to Scotland in 1822, and partially as a result of works of literature, such as those by Sir Walter Scott, capturing the public's imagination. And this period of Highland revival, as it's now called, reframed how many historians perceived the clan institutions and therefore how they discussed the fencibles, with their fundamentally Scottish Highland origins. Many of the studies that mention the fencibles, beyond mere passing comments, have a distinctly Scottish emphasis, and one landmark book more recently called them Scotland's Fame. This is largely the legacy of the Highland revival, but also the work of one man, Ian Hamilton Mackay Scobie, 1883 to 1947. Alongside his career in the British Army before and during the First World War, he developed a passionate interest in the military history of Scotland. After his retirement, he embraced a new vocation as an amateur historian. He served as an early curator of what is now the Scottish National War Museum and wrote a fair few books about his family's regiments, including the Ray or Mackay Fencibles. He presumed that all the Fencibles were all Highlanders, and his influence lasted. A 1960s investigation by the Scottish National War Museum and the little-known at the time National Army Museum found that Scobie's presumption that the Tarbert Fencibles were Scottish because they were fencibles had ignored numerous details regarding their Irish origin. One curator at the time concluded that Scobie was in his time an authority on Scottish military history, and I was brought up to believe he was God. However, although he will always be important and responsible for a lot of invaluable information, his memory is now somewhat less than glorious. Now, initially, this Highland emphasis was true, and this was partially helped by the actions of Henry Dundas, the newly made Secretary of State for War, who took the opportunity of needing regiments for Scotland's defence, but in true political style, only accepted offers from his friends, or several men he wished to have a favour owed from, such as Sir James Grant, whose regiment was given in exchange for Dundas's support in the upcoming elections. To his credit, Dundas did genuinely seem to believe that the Highland clans were still important. In one 1797 letter, he wrote that at the time the laws were made for restraining the spirit of clanship in the Highlands of Scotland, the system might be justifiable by the recent circumstances which gave rise to that policy, and he's talking about the Jacobites here, obviously. It had for many years been my opinion that those reasons, whatever they were, have ceased, and that much good in place of mischief may on various occasions arise from such a connection among persons of the same family and name. This may have still been true in some areas, but it turns out that when you make a culture illegal, that culture dies out. And that's what happened in the years after Culloden. Highland clanship was no longer the motivating factor it had once been, and clan chieftains were now more landlords over farms than leadership figures. Capitalism, eh? Mustering the banners no longer worked, and Fencible regiments couldn't fill the ranks from clans alone, and so the Fencibles were expanded across the rest of Britain from 1794 onwards. The Fencible cavalry, a new invention in 1794, were especially popular in England, offering an alternative to the militia for those without the wealth to achieve a militia commission, which, remember, we had to have a certain level of wealth to be able to get. But Fencible infantry and cavalry regiments were raised in towns, cities, and counties throughout the country. At their peak, some 30 to 35,000 men were enlisted in these regiments, raised in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and they represented between 15 and 20% of the entire British army in this period. So that's what were the Fencibles, and why were they raised in Scotland. Next, why were they popular outside of Scotland? Well, for this, we must return to what the Fencibles actually were, which, as I said earlier, were soldiers enlisted temporarily for service only in Britain. This meant that any enlistee, whether as a soldier or an officer, expected to return home, and so did not expect to go and be sent to fight the French in Flanders or to enjoy the delights of sunny weather and fever in the Caribbean and India. The worst a Fencible could expect was to be sent to Ireland to fight the rebels there, and many did indeed actively volunteer for this. But for the most, enlistment meant joining the army for garrison duty anywhere from Ipswich to Newcastle to Inverness. And this meant that the Fencibles appealed to different groups of people than the regular army. Now, because the Fencibles were legally part of the regular army, they were recruited voluntarily. with extensive use of the tried and tested methods which filled the regular army, mainly recruiting parties. These all sought to engage with potential enlistees, with posters focused on patriotism as a key motivator for service, along with emphasising the job opportunity afforded by the fencibles, along with, of course, avoiding the major occupational hazard of usually joining the army, aka being shot at. One consequence of this limited service was that newly enlisted fencibles received a smaller bounty than the regulars upon enlistment. There's this bonus that was promised to new recruits. For the regulars, this was normally between 10 and 20 guineas, but occasionally spiked to 30 or more, which was well over what an average labourer could earn in a year. By contrast, fencible bounties were usually between 5 and 10 guineas to reflect this reduced form of service. Even so, 10 guineas was a reasonable amount of money for a working man with a family to feed, and being a fencible, he was pretty much guaranteed a job for the foreseeable future, unlike those working in textiles, which was incredibly variable thanks to wartime changes or other seasonal trades such as shipbuilding or agriculture. Now, this largely explains why a reasonable proportion of the men enlisting in the fencibles were older than those joining the regulars. Not only would they remain risk-free, they would be paid well enough to support their families. It's perhaps little wonder that his General Court Martial in Jersey in November 1796, Peter Hackley of the Loyal Cheshire Fencibles, referred to the presence of his father and two brothers as soldiers in the regiment and his sister being with them. William Forrester, a non-commissioned officer in the North Lowland Fencibles, upon facing a court-martial and reduction in rank, sought his discharge rather than suffer the indignity of no longer being able to send money back to his helpless family on a mere private's pay. Yet the fencibles did also clearly have some allure for those without familial responsibilities and with a roving disposition, seeing as how they acted as a middle ground for those keen to experience the army life, the adventure it promised, without the risks of overseas service. Service in Ireland was especially promising, however, in an established 18th century context of plunder as a reward for surviving a battle, where some might recoil at the horror of killing, still others may have, dare I say, enjoyed it, and it shows in the fencibles. The regiments that recruited specifically for service in Scotland, in a period where the British Army was explicitly acting as an anti-rebellion force and was renowned for brutality, did do better than those recruiting for service in Britain. These men were not offered any additional bounty or incentive, save some regiments which offered these medals, as you can see here, but they instead offered the opportunity to exact violence against a villainous population of papists, aka Catholics. And indeed they did, which we'll come to later. As I said, Britain, not fond of the Pope. Now, it must also be considered why a man would want to be an officer in the fencibles, which largely boils down to finances. If you've not heard of the purchase system, to become an officer in the 18th century British Army, one must have bought a commission. There were near standard prices for these by the 1790s, and unless you were dishonourably discharged, you'd be able to work your way up through the ranks and retire by selling your final rank in addition to the pension you'd receive. In short, a regular commission, whilst it was a practical rank, was an investment in your future. You needed money or friends to get it, and if you were incompetent, then you'd lose it and your investment. By contrast, a fencible commission was not paid for. A colonel had complete control over who his officers were, and unsurprisingly, usually gifted them to his friends or family, or indeed those he was seeking to win over. These men were sometimes genuinely interested in becoming good soldiers, and I personally own a copy of a manual of good soldiering written by Captain Reed of the Essex Fencible Infantry. And this was especially the case for those who would not have been able to afford a regular commission, such as the factory foreman George Mackintosh, who asked his friend Thomas Balfour, the colonel, for a commission in the North Lowland Fencibles. Such men were sometimes able to get a transfer into the regulars, and this could turn out very well for them. William Gordon began his career as a cornet, so an ensign, in the Hampshire Fencible Cavalry, a very junior officer, retired a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd Dragoon Guards by 1816. And even if they didn't stay in the army, fencible service was a way to demonstrate dedication to the nation when looking for future jobs in the British state, especially for those from outside England. Henry Dundas, the Secretary of War, and his son had a renowned fondness for their fellow Scots and helped many get good jobs in India. And John Harley, who served in the Irish-raised Tarbert Fencibles, wrote about how he saw his fencible service promising a considerable advantage for his later career. However, sometimes these men were not interested in being good soldiers. Sometimes they just wanted the prestige of being a soldier without the risks of having to actually take charge in battle. Such officers proudly flaunted their new status. Captain George Swanson, Rothsay and Caithness Fencibles, was included on multiple of George Swanson's civic posts, and many men had paintings of themselves done in uniform, as we can see here. This in turn led to an epidemic of absenteeism and financial crimes. Ensign Robert Abbey, having received his commission in 1794, was in May 1799 found to have been continuing his employment for an attorney for the entire period. And one quartermaster managed to get with over £2,000 before he was caught and court-martialed for his financial abuses. So where many fencible officers saw themselves as contributing genuinely to the nation's defence, Henry Cole of the Northumberland Fencibles described his enlistment to be of no greater service to the country. Many saw their service as either a path to something else or as of no great consequence at all. Of course, if they were just discharged and went home, no harm, no foul. And here we come on to our sort of next question. If they treated themselves mostly like soldiers, with a couple of quirks, how were the fencibles treated by the government and by the public? As we've seen, there were some differences between the regular army and the fencibles. Soldiers got a smaller bounty. Officers didn't pay for their commissions. And this means that despite the fact that the fencibles were legally part of the army, they were not the same. This set them apart from the full-timers, but also from the militia, from the civilian auxiliaries, a sort of mixture of volunteer and loyalist associations, and various yeomanries, if you're familiar with them at all. As such, the distinctions between the Home Defence Forces and the British Isles looked something like this. The regulars were full-time soldiers who volunteered for a lifetime of service anywhere in the world, controlled by the War Office. Officers had bought their commissions. The fencibles were full-time soldiers who volunteered to serve during wartime within the British Isles, controlled by the War Office. Officers were given their commissions. The militia, balloted soldiers who served full-time during wartime for a fixed duration, very part-time and during peace, on an exclusively home service, usually in the same nation, i.e. England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and controlled mostly by the Lord Lieutenant and county authorities. Officers got their commission by meeting this threshold for wealth. And then the volunteers are yeomanry, part-time soldiers who volunteered to serve in the event their town or community was threatened, controlled by an elected officer from the company. As a small note of national context, although the English militia had been around for a while, the anti-Catholic British state had been very cautious about letting the Irish have their own, for the same reasons as in Scotland. These concerns had largely been abated by 1793, and so, with the Irish Lord Lieutenancy firmly established, Ireland got its own militia. Although it broadly matched the area, so in Ulster the militia was Protestant, there were militiamen from both sides of the Isle, and they did seem to get on well. Their senior commanders tended to be Protestant though, and so too was the Irish Yeomanry, which was little more than a privately run paramilitary to protect property from rioters and rebels. Now, because the fencibles were part of the regular army, they were frequently put in the position of being compared with their counterparts. However, fencible officers were widely considered not to be on equal footing with the regulars, and they were in many ways lesser than the regular army. This could be explicit. Fencibles had lower precedence within the army than the regulars, and fencible officers were expected to defer to their regular colleagues. Initially, fencibles and regulars were expected to determine seniority by their commission date, but this was superseded in 1798 by an article of war which changed the rules and said that regular commissions would always rank over the militia, fencibles and civilians. But this hierarchy could also be implicit. Although fencible regimental officers were supposed to receive the same allowances for their men as the regulars, the fact that allowances for Irish service were lower than that in Britain, for which many fencible regiments were explicitly raised, often meant fencible regiments serving in Ireland were left with less financial means to support themselves. Now, commissions were also not purchased, and because of that, they did not offer the benefits of permanent rank, such as half pay if they were retired, and they could not be sold on, and as such did not qualify a fencible officer for an exchange into the regulars at equivalent rank. If an officer sought a transfer, they were often expected to take a step down, for example, going from a lieutenant to an ensign, as were some non-commissioned officers, and they might have been asked to bring recruits with them as well. And this perception of them as lesser extended to the fencible men who, as we've discussed, received a lower bounty than the regulars. In 1795, this was set at 5 guineas lower. These limitations did have ramifications for the fencibles in the long term. They were often less useful as a branch, and accordingly they were the first to see the impact when the scarcity of public money hit regimental allowances, and this led to freezes on recruitment. A significant recruitment freeze notably took place in 1797, only shortly after a massive wave of... I got that? Not quite yet. That's fine. A massive wave of increases in 1795-96, with other demands on the regular establishment. All fencibles who did not agree to serve in Ireland or Europe were disbanded from 1799 onwards, because they just weren't useful. In the end, few were even actually sent abroad, but this prevented any more being unemployed. The fencible cavalry had struggled for recruits throughout the period, and it competed with all the different branches in England and Wales, and by 1800 it was deemed there was no further reason for them to be sustained. It having been deemed advisable as a measure founded on public economy, they were thanked for their service and assets stripped. Horses and men sent to the regulars, if they were willing at least. That being said, individually, many fencible regiments were judged positively by regular army officers, although this could vary. Some inspections led to glowing reports. The Suffolks marched uncommonly well, and the Somersets performed with precision. The criticisms many regiments received tended to be the result of poor supply or the effects of illness. One report noted that the men had been stationed a considerable time in very bad quarters, and around 80% of the less defensible infantry were declared unfit for service on the Ducks in Dublin, and they were returned to England to re-recruit. Most infamously, the Orkney contingent of the Orkney and Shetland Corps was reported as being undisciplined and totally unfit for service. Protests by their officers, emphasising the lack of barrack space and poor conditions, and citing previous quite complimentary reports, were in vain. The regiment was disbanded on Christmas Day in 1797. Now, this last example possibly best demonstrates that how on many occasions a regiment was only as good as those who led them. This was known at the time. General Champagne, I think I'm saying that wrong, his inspection of the fencibles stationed in Ireland, which I found actually here in the National Army Museum's archives, so big shout out to the Templar study room team for that, noted that the discipline and appearance vary considerably, which is principally owing to the military knowledge paid by their respective commanding officers. Junior officers, however, felt differently. Subalterns in the army were largely drawn from aristocratic gentry or otherwise landowning families, with a further quarter from those with a family tradition of professional military service. These men, whether having achieved their commissions through purchase, seniority, connections, or a combination, were known to judge those who did not fit the mould of real officers and gentlemen. Many fencible officers were brand new to the military, having more commonly obtained their commissions through political, social, or family connections, and as a result, military understandings of class and masculinity permeated the increasingly professional regular army's perception of fencible officers as lesser soldiers. And this affected how the regulars saw the fencibles. One Irish artillery officer described the garrison of Gibraltar as very weak because of its reliance on fencibles. However, on a personal level, many drew a distinction between those who intended to eventually begin a career of proper service and those who might more easily return to their civilian selves at the end of the war. The mutually understood norms of the military united all regular officers together under shared values of politeness and honour, but because fencible commissions were lesser, this just did not apply. One officer lamented of his friend Ryder Moat after having joined the Rutland Fencible Cavalry as a captain. But it was great to hear you had again submitted to a military life, but since you did so, I wish it had been in the regulars. It has never been too late to commence that career in this war. Now, although the fencibles were legally part of the army, they were an auxiliary branch. They were not intended for frontline combat, much like the militia, and as such they were often compared to them. This was most notable in Ireland, where at its peak in 1800, fencibles comprised approximately 40% of the entire garrison and 80% of the regular garrison. The fencible presence in Ireland was largely as a result of the way the regular army recruited in this period. Many regiments would stop in Ireland to recruit up to full strength before going elsewhere in the world, and about an estimated 1/3 of the army was Irish in this period. This led to widespread concerns about such a high proportion of soldiers being from a potentially disloyal population, which Ireland was seen as. The regulars were seen as being inappropriate to act as a garrison force in Ireland, being highly composed of Irish, as George III himself wrote to the Duke of York. However, The Fencibles, although not very Scottish, as we've discussed, were seen as Scottish and were therefore the solution. And were described by Pitt the Younger, at this point the Prime Minister, as peculiarly desirable to provide for the defence of Ireland. Initially poor perceptions by the Irish government, directly comparing their scandalous manner to the militia, soon gave way to a growing confidence. Fencible infantry and cavalry were both characterised as useful compensation for other regiments being removed, and by 1797, Camden, who's Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at that period, was explicitly referring to them as preferable to the Irish militia and integral to the Irish garrison. Now, Fencible regiments did serve extensively across the other auxiliary branches, both in Ireland and across Britain. In England, the Fencibles were, to all intents and purposes, a professional force. John Harley described how upon arriving in Gloucestershire from Ireland, he was invited by the commanding officer of a local volunteer company to inspect his men, supposing him to be an experienced officer. Sergeants of the Argyllshire Fencibles were even sought to train volunteers in their home counties, seemingly to some success. And in Ireland, these relationships were slightly different. As mentioned, the militia and the pre-yeomanry were predominantly officered and, in the case of the yeomanry, filled by Protestants. For these men, who also formed the vast majority of the Irish Parliament, the 1793 creation of a militia that allowed Catholics to serve was further evidence of the late 18th century British tendency to intervene in Irish self-governance. The Fencibles had been trialled in Ireland during the American War of Independence, but the 6 Fencible regiments that had been raised were all given to prominent Irish landowners and were widely derided as being puppets of British government. This previous experience rather coloured some of the Irish Protestant elite's perceptions of the Fencibles when they arrived, with Lord Downshire describing them as hardly knowing how to handle their arms. This uncomfortable relationship was exacerbated further by practical issues, such as the shortage of barrack accommodation for the newly disembarked Fencibles alongside the militia, and concerns over how the Fencibles recruiting could draw men away from the Irish militia, tempted by the superior advantages of very slightly more pay. Now, as we've seen, hopefully, there we are. As we've seen previously, the Fencibles struggled to break away from this association of being a Scottish force, despite the reality, largely because Henry Dundas was not alone in believing that the Scots were good soldiers, and the Fencibles were a good way to encourage more Scots into the army. General Stewart, who wrote a history of the Highlands and was a Scottish himself, characterised the Fencibles as a most excellent and seasonable nursery of men for regiments of the line. And Stewart was not alone. Camden in June 1798 requested for as many Fencibles from Scotland as can be persuaded. This is reflected in a small surge of regiments raised across Scotland, with several being heavily dependent upon clan infrastructure, again to mixed success. These troops were then dispatched across Ireland, responding to demands for more Scottish soldiers from regular officers such as General John Knox, who as district commander for Dungannon judged that matters are getting so bad, I think not only every Fencible regiment in Ireland should be sent into Ulster. It may have been this perception of competence that led to Fencible men being sought for drafts for the regulars throughout the period. Even from 1793, in October 1793, so barely 6 months after the regiment was raised, the Earl of Breadalbine was offering 800 men from across his 2 battalions who were eager to join the regular army. By 1800, drafts were regularly transferring Fencibles into the regulars, with many such men promised a top-up to their reduced bounty. Perhaps most notably, a small number of Fencibles, primarily from those deployed to Ireland, even contributed to the experimental corps of riflemen, later the 95th Rifles of Sharp fame. I'm sure most in the room are familiar with that at least. Where the men recruited from the regulars, who were only detached to this new regiment temporarily, and they were eventually expected to return to their parent regiments, the Fencibles had been drafted permanently. The army had been given such men an opportunity the regulars wouldn't receive until 1803, when the project was deemed a success. Even the master of the band of this new regiment was noted to have served in the Breadalbine Fencibles. In total, an estimated 400 Fencible volunteers served in this new regiment, of around whom half were Scottish, and as a result, around half the unit was comprised of Fencibles, who were, by the army standards, most competent to the performance of the duty of riflemen. The Fencibles were believed by the military leadership to have been far more than just a very profitable enterprise. For potential personal advantage of Scottish lairds, they provided very real value to the army establishment. And now we must turn to how civilians interacted with the fencibles. It's important to remember that perceptions of the regular army in England and Wales have been shaped by the lack of barrack facilities in England and Wales. British society widely believed that soldiers should be deployed alongside the nation's populace, and separating soldiers from civilians was dangerous to liberty. But many individuals also opposed private dwellings being used for billets. You really can't win. As a result, the army was often quartered in public houses and inns, in and amongst the population over which it had a duty of protection. With drunkenness already a renowned issue with soldiers, it's little wonder that behaviour often deteriorated further, including assault, robbery, and murder. Fencible regiments exhibited a similarly poor level of conduct, and civilians often responded in kind. The court records for the island of Jersey, where fencibles were stationed for most of our period, show that on at least 2 occasions civilians faced charges of assaulting fencibles. In 1801, Francois Best and Elie Civray were found guilty of having temporarily blinded a sergeant in the Loyal Irish. They spent 8 days in jail and were fined 50 livres. And then 2 gentlemen, having attacked several other sentries, were also jailed. Fencible behaviour in Britain more generally appears to have mimicked irregulars. The Duke of Hamilton raised concerns that some fencible regiments were abandoning men on the road drunk, but papers often reported good discipline from other regiments. In fact, with barrack building an essential part of Pitt's wartime policy in Britain throughout the 1790s, which aimed at reducing sedition amongst the troops and increasing operational efficiency, it was in Ireland where fencible misconduct was most pronounced. In the years preceding and succeeding the 1798 Rising, fencible soldiers were widely relied upon to support the civilian administration and to protect and control the population. Some regiments became well trusted with these duties. Correspondence from Dublin Castle from Trim warned of the possibility of jailbreaking if government does not send a strong military force of the Scotch fencibles. And Francis White in County Cavan commended the Essex fencibles for their role in placating an attack on his property. However, many fencibles developed reputations for poor behaviour across the country, particularly in relation to Catholics and suspected rebels, and likely as a result of the previously noted possibility of men enlisting specifically for the opportunity to visit violence upon such an othered population. The Breadalbane fencibles received compliments in Navan for being adapted for Irish service, but a 1796 report involving Breadalbane fencible officers assaulting Catholics who refused to acknowledge the national anthem, and this is the threat was that if the Catholic had not removed his hat, he would remove it himself and burn it upon the stage lights. And this was observed that if it was not for an apology by the Irishmen, they would have certainly been put to death by the officers. The Fraser fencibles even made the Irish press after assaulting and parading a woman suspected of supporting the United Irishmen in Newry, as we can see here. Excuse me. As the United Irishmen's rebellious activity increased, martial law was declared in March 1797, and the fencibles came under increasing pressure as part of the military establishment to act in a counter-insurgency capacity rather than merely a police force. The ancient British fencible cavalry gained a well-documented reputation for their poor conduct during their service in this period in Ulster, indiscriminately killing civilians and rebels alike. The Irish militia were disgusted at their behaviour, and one 8-page diatribe written by a local addressed to their commanding officer denounced them as an infernal pack of bloodhounds. Robert Eady recounted in his diary that by the time the second Manx fencibles, as in the Isle of Man, arrived, the population would not even spare them a cup of water. Fencible duties had escalated from arms searches and seizures to the suppression of rebellion and execution of any suspected rebels. And their behaviour does appear to have shocked the local population. One gentleman in Antrim reported that the massacres in the south had actually endeared the local Presbyterian population towards the rebels. This, of course, reached fever pitch when the rebellion broke out and was subsequently repressed in the summer of 1798, which led to several battles across Ireland, concentrated in Ulster and the southeast. The perception of the fencibles in Ireland, therefore, largely depended on which specific regions a regiment had been deployed in and which specific regiments a region had actually been able to interact with, and on the wider experience of the Rising as a whole. And Chris MacFarland has particularly highlighted the positive interactions that many Scots, under good command, had with the population they were deployed alongside. This was much the same in Britain. Some regiments experienced peaceful deployments, but the need for the soldiery to break up crowds and riots increased throughout the 1790s. In some cases, the application of force was the only way for magistrates to continue their business, and there was widespread opposition to the ballot for the raising of militia regiments, especially in Scotland and Ireland, but also across England and Wales as well. Fencible infantry were involved, but for obvious reasons, this is really where the cavalry, mounted on horseback, armed with swords, really came into their own. The most notable of these episodes occurred in Tranent in East Lothian, where the Cinque Ports and Pembrokeshire Fencible cavalries were deployed to oppose anti-militia riots agitated by local colliery communities. The extent to which these regiments responded proportionally is unclear, but with 12 civilian dead, clearly any efforts to prevent the massacre, if there had been any, were in vain. In contrast, the Lancashire Fencible cavalry, for their support against the anti-militia movement in Dumfries, were described by one author as uniting humanity with courage. I suspect he may be slightly exaggerating. This also indicates the more positive side of the reputation of the military establishment amongst certain elements of British society. For those not exposed to food shortages or facing the ballot, the arrival of the military to an area, often requiring the requisition of support with supply, was well reported by the press and more greatly linked to associations with patriotic sentiment and entertainment. It'd be remiss of me not to highlight that Eamon O'Keefe, a recent research fellow at the NAM, has explored the widespread and increasing role of military music making in public life in his work in some detail. I would definitely recommend. He's done a talk for the National Army Museum, I think, previously on this series as well. Nods from the back, that's positive. And in that vein, the band of the 1st Fencible Cavalry, who were Irish-raised, played theatrical performances in Northampton, and Maria Stanley wrote to her father from Newcastle, describing how the officers of Essex Fencibles attended parties, dinner, and tea and cards organised by her family. In some cases, the pomp and circumstance which accompanied soldiers in civilian society, augmented by colourful and visually striking uniforms, left an impression on women, and scarlet fever was well established by the waning years of the 18th century. The desires aroused by a redcoat were encouraged and discouraged across various areas of society, and the Fencibles, as pseudo-regulars, appear to have benefited from this, whilst avoiding the more cynical accusations of skulking away from combat that plagued some civilian auxiliaries. They were, however, far from welcomed by many in England. As we keep coming back to, the perceptions of the Fencibles as Scottish ran deep. And for the mid-century English public, Scotland was the refuge of historic political and religious opposition to George III. The Fencibles were a symptom of the worst of what the Scottishness offered the Union. Scots had benefited in some small capacity from satirical engagement with a good Celt, bad Celt narrative in which the Irish suffered, but this and the widely successful Scottish contributions to British military imperial success overseas was not enough to fully diminish the negative perceptions of Scottish home defence within Britain. Scots did still retain a sense of savagery, and many English feared an influx of Scottish workers would threaten their employment. To those with such a poor image of the Scottish population and soldiery, the Fencibles were not welcome, and it became common to associate the name Fencible with Scottish soldiers negatively. English Scotophobia and othering therefore found a home in print, as we can see here, but it also found a print depicting the Fencibles as incompetent or unfit for service. One 1794 depiction published in London, entitled Village Fencibles or County Recruits, played into the existing stereotypes of militia forces as being untrainable, but also included specific elements of Scots dialect in the captions. I kind of twist and rabbit it, and you see there two particular examples really highlighting the Scots dialect. These new recruits were also depicted in working smocks and garments more common to agricultural workers, and this demographic comprised a high proportion of military enlistees in Scotland anyway, hence the use of the village in the title. This was much unlike England, throughout which urban areas contributed more to recruitment. As a result, alongside a more general commentary on them being untrainable, the recruits depicted here as village fencibles were part of a population widely derided south of the border, and in several cases are implied to be cowards, the last man here being very keen to be sent home. Other examples were less explicit, but still utilised the established link between the name Fencible and other negative connotations of Scottish martial tradition and Scottishness. In some cases, they began satirising the regiments even before they were raised, relying heavily on this name association and using the county descriptor. one October 1794 depiction of the Hampshire Fencible Cavalry riding pigs, which the National Army Museum has a wonderful copy of, as we can see here, ineffectually protecting their bacon, refers to them as the Hampshire Fencibles, a name many English Fencible Cavalry rejected for the associations. And this cartoon was produced mere months after their recruiting began. They clearly hadn't been on active service. They appear to have relocated to Wiltshire by that point. And such an early comment can't have been based on any long-term observation. These cartoons give insight into the wider English perceptions of the lack of value of Scots to the British Home Defence Network, despite the reality of their contribution. And likewise, the ballad entitled The Glory of Limerick illustrates a feeling among some of the Irish population that the Fencibles were sent to watch us here, including a lyric suggesting they would be crying home with their kilties, but focuses much more on the English foe and government restrictions. It's clear that the civilian link between Scottishness and Fencibles was more commonly an English phenomenon. In the English public eyes, the Scottish Fencibles were likely to be ineffectual and unfit for service. For the Irish, they were symptomatic of a British interference which would last well for some time. And so at last we turn to why all of this has shaped how the Fencibles have been discussed since. Well, as I mentioned earlier, a major factor has to be the Highland Revival. This baked in the conception of Scottishness to what the Fencibles were, and despite the reality being far different, and even beyond contemporary perceptions. But I think a broader factor has to be when they served and how we engage with this period of history. The Fencibles were only contracted to serve for the duration of the war, and in 1802, despite later conflict, the war ended. Some transferred into the regular army, some went home. So when the war restarted 10 months later, they weren't needed anymore. They'd been replaced, finally, by a Scottish militia, which was made possible through the creation of Lord Lieutenancies in 1794. The Fencibles had been made defunct. Now, it must be noted that some Fencibles were later raised in Canada as a direct result of them being raised in Britain. The men of the Glengarry Fencibles made a deal with the British government to settle parts of Canada in exchange for their service there. They were reformed in 1812 as the Glengarry Fencible Light Infantry, and they, along with several other Fencible regiments and thousands of militia, successfully fought back an American invasion during the War of 1812, and they have remained famous in Canada since, but not here. And I think the reason is that they weren't raised after 1803, when the British Army was at its most successful against Napoleonic France. Has anyone ever heard of the concept of periodization? A couple of hands, maybe? It's the idea of defining a historical period using brackets at the beginning and end. And that idea isn't new. The process of periodization is far from an exact method. It certainly does make the past a bit easier to handle. Trying to look at themes across centuries is not the easiest task. And restricting topics or concepts to decades, years, months can make them more practical. What this does tend to do, unfortunately, is prevent us situating work in the wider context. And it's certain types of stuff that suffers as a result. So for our purposes, where would you all draw the line around the Napoleonic Wars? Anyone got any ideas? 1802 to 1815. Okay, 1815 because the Battle of Waterloo. We'd all agree it sort of ends there. So 1802, the French Revolution isn't part of that. Do we all agree with that? Maybe. Could this maybe be different? Now, I would agree. I think Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo is a really nice way to end it. But does it start in 1802 or 1803? Or 1793, but does that mean the Napoleonic Wars should be called the French Wars? And how do we situate this period around other events, namely the period before, which is sometimes called the Age of Revolutions, or the period after, unhelpfully, which of course also includes some revolutions. The long 19th century usually means drawing a line from the French Revolution to the First World War, and Eric Hobsbawm's book is the most famous example of this. The long 18th century in Britain usually means starting in 1714 or maybe 1688 and running up to Waterloo. And if we take this long 18th century idea, which I do, when does it end if not 1793, 1800? Do you draw it in 1801 with the Act of Union? Or indeed, as Linda Colley famously did, she draws it in 1837. But that's still very Anglo-European, British-centric. The Irish establishment existed independently from 1660 to 1801. So you might choose to follow that, or you might instead be guided by the Irish rebellions, as the Irish curriculum still is today. And I strongly believe that seeing the French Revolutionary Wars as the prequel to the main event, i.e. Napoleon, is a periodization that greatly causes the experience of the 1790s to suffer in modern perceptions and understandings. And I'll admit, I understand why. Napoleon and Wellington both really got stuck into their careers in the 1790s, and Napoleon is the man who defines the period. But the British state and the people were not consciously aware that they had entered a new age in 1790 or 1793 or 1802. Administration, print culture, religion, clothing, none of this changed like that, and all were thoroughly grounded in the 18th century. This is especially apparent in relation to the military and to the Home Defence Network. So, to recap. The Fencibles were a branch of the British Army that was raised to serve during the French Revolutionary Wars to protect the British Isles. They were initially a Scottish idea, owing to distrust of the population, but they quickly became popular across the British Isles. They recruited like the regulars, and they appealed to much of the same type of men, but they offered a supposedly easier time of it. The government largely saw them as another resource. Many of their colleagues distrusted them, and the use of the Fencibles as riot control and counterinsurgency played a major role in negative perceptions of them, exacerbated by Scotophobia in the English population. And they've often been forgotten because we often forget this period. But their memory is still as alive as ever, both through my own work, but also countless others who've researched them themselves, or that I've spoken to personally while researching their own family history, or more generally, anyone exploring the British experiences of the 1790s. Thank you very much.